Between 1964 and 1973, more bombs were dropped on a small Southeast Asian country than were used in all of World War II. The target was not Berlin, not Tokyo, not even Hanoi. It was Laos, a nation officially neutral, a country most Americans could not locate on a map. There was no formal declaration of war, no daily headlines, no national debate. For nearly a decade, an entire conflict unfolded in the shadows, hidden behind classified briefings and carefully worded press statements, and when it ended, the silence remained. The question is not only why it happened, but how something so vast could remain so invisible. Chapter 1. A neutral country in a not-so-neutral war in 1962, Laos was supposed to be neutral. The Geneva Accords, signed by 14 nations including the United States and the Soviet Union, recognized Laos as a sovereign state that would not align itself with either side of the Cold War. On paper, it was a diplomatic solution designed to prevent Southeast Asia from becoming another proxy battlefield. But neutrality in the Cold War was rarely respected. Laos shared a long, porous border with Vietnam. As the conflict in Vietnam escalated, North Vietnamese forces began using eastern Laos as a logistical corridor. This network of roads and jungle paths, later known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, became a critical supply artery. Weapons, food, ammunition, and troops flowed southward through Laotian territory into South Vietnam. From Washington's perspective, the trail was not just a supply line. It was the backbone of the communist war effort. Publicly, the United States was committed to respecting Laotian neutrality. Privately, it reached a different conclusion. If the Ho Chi Minh Trail could not be stopped in Vietnam, it would be targeted in Laos. The strategy would not be debated in Congress. It would not be announced to the American public. It would not even be fully acknowledged on official maps. Instead, it would be conducted quietly under the authority of the executive branch and the Central Intelligence Agency. The conflict in Laos did not begin with massive bombing. It began with covert operations. CIA officers were dispatched to organize local resistance forces among the Hmong ethnic minority in northern Laos. Under the leadership of General Vong Bao, tens of thousands of Hmong fighters were trained, armed, and funded to disrupt North Vietnamese movements. It was, in effect, a secret army. While American soldiers fought openly in Vietnam, another war was unfolding across the mountains and jungles of Laos, one that most Americans had never heard of. Airfields were constructed in remote valleys. Supply drops became routine. Unmarked aircraft flew missions that officially did not exist. Then, in 1964, the scale changed. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the rapid expansion of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, American leadership concluded that air power could compensate for limited ground control in Laos. The result was Operation Barrel Roll in the north and Operation Steel Tiger in the south, sustained bombing campaigns targeting North Vietnamese positions and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operations were classified. Missions were flown from Thailand. Official briefings described them in vague terms, often avoiding the word Laos altogether. Even many members of Congress were unaware of the scope. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped over 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. On average, a planeload of bombs fell every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for nearly 9 years. It made Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in modern history. Yet there were no front-page photographs, no embedded journalists, no official war. This was the paradox: a massive air campaign conducted in the name of stopping communism, while publicly denying that a war in Laos even existed. And as the bombs fell, another reality began to take shape, one that would outlast the Cold War itself. Because the bombs did not all explode, and decades later, long after the politics had shifted and the generals had retired, the war would still be claiming victims. But to understand how that happened, we have to examine what kind of war this truly was, and why secrecy became its most powerful weapon. Chapter 2. The Mechanics of a Secret War. The bombing of Laos was not chaotic. It was systematic. From air bases in Thailand, particularly Udon Thani and Nakhon Phanom, American aircraft launched daily sorties over territory that officially did not exist in public war briefings. Pilots were often told they were flying in support of operations in Vietnam, language carefully crafted to avoid legal and political complications. In reality, entire regions of Laos were designated as free fire zones. At the center of this campaign was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, not a single road but a sprawling network of paths, pipelines, truck routes, and jungle corridors stretching hundreds of miles. It was constantly repaired, rerouted, and camouflaged by North Vietnamese engineers. The more it was bombed, the more resilient it became. American strategy relied heavily on air power. B-52 Stratofortresses dropped massive payloads designed to obliterate supply routes. Fighter bombers carried out tactical strikes. Sensor technology was deployed in the jungle to detect movement, an early form of electronic surveillance warfare. When trucks were detected at night, aircraft would be dispatched to destroy them. It was industrialized bombing, driven by data. Yet there was a contradiction at the heart of the operation. Despite the scale of destruction, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was never fully severed. North Vietnamese logistics adapted with remarkable speed. Roads were rebuilt within days. Supplies were dispersed. Routes were split into smaller paths, making them harder to target. The bombing intensified anyway. Cluster munitions became a defining feature of the campaign. Designed to disperse hundreds of smaller bomblets over wide areas, they were intended to maximize damage against moving targets. In theory, they were efficient. In practice, they created a legacy no strategist had publicly accounted for. An estimated 270 million cluster submunitions were dropped on Laos. A significant percentage failed to detonate on impact. They remained embedded in soil, rice fields, forests, and village pathways, armed but dormant. At the time, the priority was immediate tactical gain. The long-term consequences were rarely discussed. Meanwhile, on the ground, the CIA-directed secret army expanded. Hmong fighters engaged in brutal mountain warfare, often outnumbered and under relentless air attack from opposing forces. Entire communities were displaced. Young boys were recruited as soldiers. Villages became temporary bases, then targets. The war blurred lines between military and civilian spaces. In remote regions like the Plain of Yars, bomb craters multiplied into the thousands. Agricultural land became battlefields. Families fled repeatedly, sometimes returning to find their homes erased. Yet within the United States, public awareness remained minimal. The Vietnam War dominated headlines, protests, televised combat footage, rising casualty counts. Laos, by contrast, remained a classified appendix. Journalists who attempted to investigate faced limited access. Official acknowledgement was cautious and partial. Then, in 1969, the secrecy deepened. When Richard Nixon entered office, the bombing did not decrease. It expanded, particularly in neighboring Cambodia, but Laos remained a sustained theater of air operations. Internal debates within the administration revolved around escalation and leverage in peace negotiations with North Vietnam. Air power was seen not only as a military tool, but as diplomatic pressure. And yet, by the early 1970s, it was becoming clear that the strategic objectives were not being achieved. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued functioning. North Vietnamese forces maintained presence. The secret army suffered devastating losses. The bombing persisted until 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords formally ended direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. With the stroke of a pen, the official war concluded. In Laos, however, the aftermath was only beginning. Because the most enduring weapon of the secret war was not the B-52. It was what remained beneath the surface, unexploded, unstable, and invisible. And as political attention shifted elsewhere, Laos was left to confront a war that did not end when the planes stopped flying. The real cost would not be measured in sorties or tonnage. It would be measured in decades. Chapter 3. The War That Didn't End. When the bombing stopped in 1973, the aircraft returned to their bases. The classified briefings were archived, and American attention shifted elsewhere. But in Laos, the war did not conclude with a treaty. It settled into the soil. An estimated 30% of the cluster bomblets dropped over Laos failed to detonate. That meant tens of millions of small metal spheres, each roughly the size of a tennis ball, remained scattered across farmland, forests, and riverbanks. They blended into the landscape. To a child, they could resemble toys. To a farmer, they were hidden just inches beneath a plow blade. The United States had deployed them as a tactical solution. For rural Laotian communities, they became a permanent hazard. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, accidents were common. Farmers clearing fields for rice cultivation would strike buried ordnance. Children collecting scrap metal to sell would handle unexploded cluster munitions without understanding what they were. Entire villages lived with a quiet daily risk not of renewed invasion, but of sudden detonation. The casualties did not make international headlines. There was no battlefield correspondent to document them. Injuries often meant amputations, blindness, or death in remote areas far from advanced medical care. For many families, the explosion of a single bomblet could erase a generation's stability. By some estimates, Tens of thousands of Laotians have been killed or injured by unexploded ordnance since the war officially ended. Many of them were born years after the final bomb fell. This is the paradox of the secret war. Its most lethal phase unfolded in peacetime. Meanwhile, political change reshaped the country. In 1975, the Pathet Lao, backed by North Vietnam, took control, establishing the Lao People's Democratic Republic. The Hmong fighters who had aligned with the CIA faced retaliation and persecution. Thousands fled across the Mekong River into Thailand. Many were later resettled in the United States, carrying with them memories of a war few Americans knew had been fought. For Washington, Laos became a closed chapter, strategically complex, politically sensitive, and diplomatically inconvenient. Official acknowledgement of the bombing campaign expanded gradually over time, particularly as declassified documents surfaced. But acknowledgement did not immediately translate into remediation. Clearing unexploded ordnance is slow, meticulous work. Each device must be located, identified, and safely destroyed. Entire provinces remain contaminated. Some estimates suggest that significant portions of arable land in eastern Laos are still affected decades later. And here lies the deeper contradiction. The bombing campaign was justified as a means of protecting South Vietnam and limiting communist expansion. Yet by 1975, Saigon had fallen. The United States withdrew. The geopolitical objective collapsed. What remained was not victory or defeat, but unexploded consequences. For rural Laotians born long after the Cold War, geopolitics is not an abstract debate. It is a rusted metal object beneath the soil. It is a warning sign at the edge of a field. It is the knowledge that history can erupt without warning. But the story of the secret war does not end only in tragedy. It also forces a reckoning not just about strategy, but about accountability. Because once secrecy fades, responsibility begins. And the question that lingers is whether nations can ever fully account for wars they never officially declared. That question would slowly return to Washington, carried not by generals, but by survivors. Chapter 4, The Slow Reckoning. For years, the bombing of Laos lived in the margins of history, acknowledged in fragments, discussed in academic circles, but rarely confronted at the highest political levels. It was easier to fold it into the broader narrative of Vietnam than to examine it as its own war. But survivors did not forget. By the 1990s, as Cold War tensions eased and diplomatic relations between the United States and Laos gradually normalized, the issue of unexploded ordnance could no longer be ignored. Humanitarian organizations began conducting systematic surveys of contaminated land. What they found confirmed what villagers had lived with for decades. Large areas of eastern and northern Laos were still seeded with unexploded cluster munitions. Clearing them required precision and patience. Teams would scan the ground meter by meter, marking signals, digging carefully, and detonating devices in controlled blasts. It was slow, dangerous work. At that pace, experts warned, complete clearance could take generations. International funding began to support these efforts, including contributions from the United States. In 2016, during a visit to Laos, President Barack Obama formally acknowledged the scale of the bombing campaign and announced expanded funding for unexploded ordnance removal. It was one of the most public recognitions of the secret war by a sitting U.S. president. Yet acknowledgement is not the same as closure. The legal framework surrounding cluster munitions evolved over time. In 2008, the Convention on Cluster Munitions was adopted, banning their use, production, and transfer among signatory states. Laos became a strong advocate for the treaty, shaped by lived experience. The United States, however, did not join the convention. This divergence reflects the unresolved tension at the heart of the story: strategic necessity versus humanitarian cost. Military planners argue that air power and cluster munitions were tools shaped by the logic of Cold War containment. Survivors argue that the consequences outlasted the strategy. And both are historically true. The bombing of Laos was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy choice, carried out under the belief that air superiority could shape geopolitical outcomes without the political burden of a declared war. It represented a model of modern conflict, distant, technologically advanced, and partially concealed. But concealment has limits. As documents were declassified and testimonies surfaced, the narrative shifted. What had once been a footnote became a case study in the hidden costs of proxy wars. Universities examined it. Journalists revisited it. Veterans spoke about missions that, for years, they had been instructed not to discuss. The war re-entered public consciousness not through spectacle, but through documentation. And yet, even today, many people remain unaware that Laos was bombed more heavily per capita than any other country in modern history. The scale is staggering. The silence surrounding it, equally so, which raises a deeper question. If a war is never formally declared, if it unfolds without daily press coverage, if it is managed through classified briefings and coded language, does it occupy the same moral space as an open conflict, or does secrecy dilute accountability? The secret war in Laos suggests that invisibility does not erase impact. It simply postpones recognition, and recognition, when it arrives, often carries an uncomfortable weight. Because by the time the world looks back, the damage is already part of the landscape. Chapter 5. Echoes beneath the soil. There is a field in eastern Laos where the earth looks ordinary. Green rice shoots sway in the wind. Children walk narrow dirt paths between homes built on stilts. At first glance, nothing suggests that this ground once absorbed the weight of one of the most intense aerial bombardments in modern history. But beneath that surface, history waits. For families who live here, the secret war is not a chapter in a textbook. It is an inherited condition. It shapes where they farm, where they build, where their children are allowed to play. It shapes the geometry of daily life in visible boundaries drawn not by fences but by memory and caution. The bombs were meant to disrupt supply lines. Instead, they disrupted generations. What makes the story of Laos uniquely unsettling is not only the scale of destruction but the distance between decision and consequence. Strategic calculations were made thousands of miles away, in rooms insulated from the terrain they would transform. Tons of ordnance were logged, targets mapped, missions completed. On paper, they were operations. On the ground, they became scars. And yet, the bombing of Laos was not an anomaly. It was a preview. It foreshadowed a style of warfare that would become increasingly common, remote, technologically dominant, politically ambiguous. Wars without declarations, campaigns conducted through air power, proxies, and classified directives. Conflicts that expand without formally existing. Laos was an early laboratory for that model. The logic behind it was clear. Avoid large troop deployments, minimize domestic backlash, apply pressure without triggering formal escalation. But the moral clarity of a declared war was replaced by something more diffuse. A conflict that could be waged intensely while remaining partially invisible to the very public funding it. And that invisibility changed how war was perceived. If citizens are unaware, scrutiny diminishes. If scrutiny diminishes, duration extends. If duration extends, consequences compound.